The Mediterranean, cradle of civilizations. The first sea peoples, Aegeans, Phoenicians, and Egyptians, appeared in the 3rd century BC. They were the inventors of the sail. Within a few centuries, the Mediterranean became a sort of huge interior lake, facilitating exchanges between Africa, the Middle East, and Southern Europe. Beginning in the Middle Ages, the emergence of the great maritime powers would transform the Mediterranean basin from a place of trade to one of war. A part of this history would take place in the Ligurian Sea, an arm of the Mediterranean between Corsica and the shores of France and Italy. To discover some of the cities that played a role in this adventure, we embark on the 4-masted sailing ship Star Clipper. First stop, Corsica. After a night of sailing, the mountains of Corsica loom on the horizon.
Okay, starboard side, pilot letter, starboard side, thank you. Channel 16,
Soon, Bastia appears off the bow just as the harbor pilot comes aboard to help the ship's captain maneuver into the port.
I think it would be better to make a round. All right, no problem. Hard to starboard.
We drop anchor a few cable lengths from the docks. Bastia's natural harbor was used from ancient times by numerous Mediterranean peoples, but it was the Genoese at the end of the 14th century who constructed the maritime fortifications that we see today.
The Genoese left a strong imprint. We're standing here only a few feet from the governor's palace. This was the heart of Corsica. Over the centuries, Corsicans lived according to the laws and decrees that emanated from this palace. You have to remember that. So Bastia obviously had a strong Genoese influence.
Genoa not only imposed its own laws, both administrative and military, but its architectural style as well. The curves and scrolls of Baroque art flourished on palace walls and church pediments.
The name Bastia, the etymology of the word, comes from the Bastille, the donjon that is just a few meters from here. Bastille or Bastilla in Italian. There are the two cities facing each other. The lower city, Terra Vecchia, the old city. Why old city? Because it existed long before Terra Nova, where we are now, which is the citadel that was built by the Genoese in 1380, surrounded by ramparts designed like a checkerboard, with streets at right angles, facilitating circulation and also very practical for the police. This was the Genoese design par excellence. The lower city, much more chaotic, more tortuous, was inhabited mainly by fishermen, also by the lower classes for a certain time. and later by wealthier people who came to live here during the 17th and 18th centuries. The two cities obviously coexisted over many years, but at certain periods there were clashes, jealousies and quarrels.
Just a few steps away from the narrow passageways of Terra Vecchia is St. Nicholas Square. Vast, impeccably laid out with its music pavilion. Here we see Bastia, French, imperial, in the style of Haussmann. Belonging to Pisa during the Middle Ages, Cape Corsica became Genoese in 1284. It's a wild and magnificent landscape. Here along the shore, the vestiges of Genoese watchtowers stretch into the distance. Guy Mikheev has dedicated his life to cataloging, protecting, and sometimes reconstructing these towers, ghostly testaments to many centuries of Corsican history.
If I had to describe Cape Corsica in a few words, I'd say that it's a peninsula oriented toward the Gulf of Genoa, with one finger pointed towards the Gulf of Liguria. It's the area the closest to terra firma, the mainland. When the Barbary pirates first attacked the Western Mediterranean, they had the support of the Turkish Seljukids, who had taken Constantinople and who occupied the Eastern Mediterranean. The Turks were contesting Spanish expansion in the Western Mediterranean territories, and it was only natural that they based their claims on these lands once ruled by Barbary pirates, and that now more or less correspond to Tunisia, Libya, Morocco, and Algeria. From ports on these coasts, raids were launched that would threaten the existence of Italian, Spanish, and island populations. Cape Corsica was extremely vulnerable. There wasn't a single year without pillage or people sold into slavery. The historians of that period, and even certain contemporary historians, say that Cape Corsica was largely emptied of its inhabitants.
To protect the villages from the raids of Barbary pirates, the Genoese erected hundreds of towers around Cape Corsica.
When the inhabitants went to exploit the desert region of Agriates, they left from here by boat, crossed the Gulf, stayed a month or two, then returned. So the tower served as a sort of lookout post. Certain garrisons were paid by the local communes, but the garrisons of other towers were paid by the Camera, that is the Genoese tax office.
Was it the memory of those murderous raids that led the Corsicans to move away from the sea? Did these shores offer, in spite of their beauty, only an illusion of protection, a comforting silhouette? To find the true feel and spirit of this land, should we head toward the mountain summits? And what if Corsica wasn't an island, but a continent instead? From Carchetu, his village situated in the heart of Castaniche, Jean-Claude is perhaps the only person to be able to answer these questions.
These places were chosen because of the climate. It's very sunny along these mountain ridges. Chestnut trees grow here. And on these plateaus, we also cultivate wheat and grow gardens. And then there was the strategic factor. You have to remember that the plains were vulnerable to the incursions of the Barbary pirates, and therefore it was necessary to retreat rapidly to shelter. And where were the most strategic locations? The ridges on which the fortified tower houses were built.
Jean-Claude loves his village. He loves the stones of the houses, the stones of the Tivola towers that he has restored over the years and transformed into guest rooms. His guests soon become his friends. An inventive storyteller and purveyor of dreams, Jean-Claude initiates us into the legends and adventure stories that conjure up another Corsica, a phantasmagorical world where thousand-year-old trees possess strange powers.
The chestnut trees are more than mere trees. They are the staff of life. The entire population of Castaniche used to live off them. And in turn, the chestnut trees were nurtured by the population. So there was a kind of osmosis between them. These people, who always feared the attacks that might come from the sea, took refuge in the mountains. Here they could make use of trees to build houses with solid beams, with chestnut walls, floors, furniture, and window frames. Chestnut wood also provided warmth, and the people gathered far into the night around the hearth. It was during these gatherings that legends were born, and storytellers told of events, both real or imagined. This giant chestnut tree that spreads its tentacles above is named Malconcine. Malconcine means the meeting place of evil. And if we look carefully, we understand that this is more than just a tree. It is perhaps 1,000 years old, perhaps even ageless. And on the bark, there are these gashes, lines, the heads of witches and monsters, strange and fantastic characters.
The Star Clipper set sail from Bastia. After rounding Cape Corsica, we head for Calvi.
fine. What is the depth?
The Calvi citadel is the work of the Genoese. Begun in 1453 and strengthened throughout the 15th century, the Calvi fortress demonstrates the Genoese determination to stay in Corsica. Here we're a long way from the small towers that protected the Cape Corsica villages. The Barbary pirates multiplied their raids, but without major consequences. The real danger came from Francois I. To checkmate Charles V in the Mediterranean, the King of France formed an alliance with the Turks. After seizing Bastia, Ajaccio, and Bonifacio, French warships and Turkish galleys headed by Dragut the Corsair tried to take Calvi in 1553. But after 2 years of siege, the Turks and French gave up, and Calvi remained Genoese.
In Calvi, the ramparts are really massive, really imposing, built on a rock. If you took the citadel apart, its base would be grey granite rock, bare without any vegetation, resembling a bald skull. Calvi comes from calvus, which means bald in Latin. On the opposite side, there is a relatively deep gulf, which is closed at one end by the spale point. This offered shelter to ships seeking a safe harbour, even more so because of Revelata Point, an arm of land in the sea, a peninsula that was a veritable dam against Mediterranean storms.
The memory of the Franco-Turk siege of 1555 cemented a durable relationship between the people of Calvi and the Genoese. The latter, as a gesture of thanks, put up an inscription at the entrance of the town, Civitas Calvi Semper Fidelis, the city of Calvi always faithful. Calvi is a favorite tourist destination in Corsica. Usually visitors only notice the fortifications, the beautiful salt tower, except when a fishing boat returns to port.
At first, fishing for me was a passion. I say passion because my parents had a house on the sea. And so, little by little, I started fishing in small boats. I also did some underwater fishing. I liked it, so I kept doing it. Corsicans are not really sea people. You have to admit that they're mountain people. When I go out to sea, there aren't many Corsican boats that are there for fishing. Even young people now, you show them a fish, and they don't know what it is. They don't know the different kinds of fish, what they're called and all that. They just don't know. You could say it's been a good fishing day. I haven't unloaded because of the bad weather. We had force 5 or 6 winds. So I just left everything on the boat. I caught a beautiful leerfish, as you can see. Some spiny lobsters. So you could say I've had a good day.
As the day ends, we cast off. The Star Clipper softly glides over the surface of the water. But once beyond Point Revelata, which protects the town, a violent wind comes up, forcing the sailors to rapidly haul down the sails. Through rough seas, we continue our voyage towards Ajaccio. After a stormy night of sailing, the sea is calm again as we approach Ajaccio. The harbor pilot, who has just come aboard, confirms that last night there were wind gusts of more than 100 kilometers per hour. In those conditions, many boats came to take shelter in the Gulf of Ajaccio, the largest gulf on the island. The founding of Ajaccio dates back to the 13th century. In 1272, while searching for a safe harbor between Calvi to the north and Bonifacio to the south, the Genoese discovered the Gulf of Ajaccio and decided to establish a small colony there. But it was not until 1492 that they began the construction of the fortress. From then on, the maritime destiny of the city was assured. Thus, in the 19th century, most of the island's maritime traffic passed through Ajaccio.
There were many boat connections between Corsican cities. For example, to go from Ajaccio to Bastia, you could often take the boats that went around the island. That's certainly what Napoleon did. There were also boats going from Propriano to Bonifacio. In the end, boats were the most comfortable, since Corsica had practically no roads at the time, but there were plenty of trails. It's true that the Corsicans are much more oriented towards land than sea, but you can be sure that there were sailors here. They manned the sailing ships that linked Corsica to the continent, and there were also a lot of fishermen. There were 500 or 600 coral fishermen who went as far as the coast of Algeria, along the Barbary coast, as they called it then. Corsica didn't have much to export, and the crossings were so long and dangerous. It took 4 or 5 days just to get to Marseille.
A century ago, Mérimée compared the Gulf of Ajaccio to the Bay of Naples. It is true that unlike Bastia and Calvi, which seem like prisoners of their fortifications, Ajaccio was able to break out and position itself much closer to the coast. Would that have contributed to giving Ajaccio a more cosmopolitan, more Mediterranean character?
All or most of the original families contributed to the founding line. There are still names that sound Genoese, but there was much interbreeding. Ajaccio became a melting pot of the early inhabitants together with the Genoese, the French, the English, the pirates of the Barbary coast. There was a bit of everything, including the Spanish at one time. It was a Spanish colony.
With the constant interbreeding that was so characteristic of the Mediterranean, what do we know of Napoleon's ancestral origins? Were the Bonapartes among the 100 families that arrived here from Liguria in 1493? We don't know if the name was Bonaparte or Buonaparte. Napoleon himself used to sign his name Buonaparte when he was a young man. Later, he dropped the U and it became Bonaparte. It was certainly a Genoese family to begin with, but how much of Genoese extraction actually remained in the Bonaparte family? Little by little, people from Genoa, Pisa, or the Barbary coast shaped the maritime history of Corsica. Let's head toward Italy now, and more precisely, to the island of Elba. To many people, it was Napoleon who first put the island of Elba on the map by being exiled there. But in ancient times, the island was already famous for its iron mines. They gave the capital its name, Porto Ferrari, the iron port. Built upon ancient Ligurian and Etruscan cities, Porto Ferrari encircles the harbor like an amphitheater. Controlled by Pisa during the Middle Ages, the town came under the power of the Medicis and of Tuscany in the 14th century. Porto Ferrari was built according to a clever, well-conceived design that is still evident today in the crisscross layout of the streets, some of which end in stairways to the sea.
The island of Elba is in the center of the Western Mediterranean. It has played an important role since the ancient Etruscan and Roman areas, as well as throughout medieval and modern times. Porto Ferrari always had the benefit of strong political protection, like that of Cosimo de' Medici, which gave it certain technical and cultural advantages, thanks to the skill of architects in Cosimo de' Medici's entourage. This city was planned and built according to an extremely functional plan. The architects who designed the city imagined it like a military machine. Cosimo de' Medici was the true founder of this city. He established its political identity and gave it its name, Cosmopolis. By this obviously powerful and pompous name, Cosimo played on a double meaning. Cosmopolis, as the city of Cosimo, but also Cosmopolis, city of the cosmos. The cosmos being the opposite of chaos, and meaning a city of harmony and order.
After Cosimo de' Medici, Napoleon was the second great man of the island. Like his illustrious predecessor of the Renaissance, and during the several months he spent here, he was also very busy organizing, legislating, constructing roads, in other words, governing.
This residence, this little abode, as Napoleon called it, the Palais des Moulins, was the little royal palace, the seat of the Principality of Elba. Napoleon chose this building because of two advantages. It was close to both the town and the sea, and also because its terrace dominated the entrance to the Gulf of Porto Ferrari. With the Treaty of Fontainebleau, Napoleon renounced 99% of his empire, but kept the island of Elba. This allowed him to keep the title of emperor. Emperor of a ridiculously tiny empire, perhaps, but emperor nevertheless.
We're at sea again, cruising along the Ligurian coast. We're on our way to Portofino. Portofino is one of the most fashionable towns on the Italian Riviera. And although it's a mecca for the rich and famous, its glamorous reputation shouldn't obscure the rare beauty of this natural site, which has been renowned since ancient times.
Behind us is one of the most protected bays in Italy, and of the entire Mediterranean. In Roman times it was already called Portus Delphini, the port of the dolphin, because of its crystal clear waters. And still today, the triangle formed by Corsica, the Ligurian coast, and the French Riviera is a sanctuary for the whales and dolphins that come to reproduce in these waters every year. Behind us is the Gulf of Tigullio, and the Bay of Portofino is the most closed off, the most protected part of the Gulf.
It was largely after World War II that the wealthy Milanese industrialists started to have their sumptuous villas built overlooking the Bay of Portofino. During the summer, they never go down to the port, undoubtedly so as to avoid the numerous tourists on their day trips from Genoa or Porto Venere. Elegant boutiques, restaurants, souvenir shops, all of the town's commercial activity is geared towards tourism, including the bakery, where local focaccia bread now costs a fortune. If Portofino became one of the most famous spots on the Riviera, it was thanks to Hollywood film stars, and particularly the actor Rex Harrison. Having had a few too many drinks while celebrating his Oscar there, it was reported that he accidentally dropped the statuette in the port. After Rex Harrison, other Hollywood stars came to Portofino, like Clark Gable or Elizabeth Taylor, but also musical celebrities like Maria Callas, Hollywood stars also drew famous politicians like Winston Churchill, famous duos like Laurel and Hardy, Ava Gardner and Humphrey Bogart. One either comes to Portofino incognito or like the royal family of Monaco, to be seen. Continuing its journey, the Star Clipper set sail for Saint-Tropez. Like Portofino, Saint-Tropez, by its familiar name, is recognized as one of the hotspots of the in-crowd. Just as with its Italian rival, its recent notoriety must not overshadow the city's long and brilliant history. Colonized by the Romans, later occupied by the Saracens, Saint-Tropez made history by becoming a maritime republic in the mid-15th century. At that time, the patron saint of the city was already celebrated in the Bravade Festival, which is an ongoing tradition. The patron saint is carried in a procession through the streets of the town, accompanied by hussars, musketeers, and sailors. The port of Saint-Tropez, where luxurious yachts are now moored, was a traditional commercial port just a few decades ago. Marius Astezan, president of the local association, Les Amis de la Bravade, remembers the era well.
It was a very important fishing port, and a little commercial port as well, because everything was transported by sea then. There used to be boats called the tartanes. They were about 20 to 25 meters long, with very deep holes. At first they were powered by steam, and later also by motor. At that time, I still remember it, there were wine barrels lined up the entire length of the port. It was bustling with activity.
Like its rival Portofino, this little provincial village owes its notoriety to the arrival of famous artists, writers, and film celebrities who arrived here after World War II. Simone Duckstein recalls those years when the little fishing port became a legend.
La Ponche is a neighborhood where the fishermen lived. This little fishing port that became so famous was once the poorest port of Saint-Tropez. But after the war, it started booming again. In those days, there were still the small bars where the fishermen went every night to play cards or drink pastis. One of the summer visitors said to my mother, "Margot, you should put some tables and chairs outside. It would be more pleasant to have a drink there in the evening." And that is how it all began. And so the Little Fisherman's Bar has become the little four-star hotel, famous worldwide, thanks to François Sagan, Juliette Greco, Annabelle Buffet, and so many others who adored this place.
Our trip exploring the shores of Corsica and the Ligurian Sea ends at Saint Florent. A few kilometers inland, gradually descending toward the sea, is the famous Patrimonio vineyard.
The first Corsican vineyards were planted by the Phaeacians, the ancient people of Marseille, or by the Greeks in 600 BC. Later, more vines were planted under the Roman occupation. On Patrimonio, we still find traces of old vineyards dating back to the 12th century, when the island was still ruled by Pisa. The monks of La Gorgone, an island off the coast of Italy, came to evangelize Corsica after it had been overrun and even occupied by Barbary pirates. Since wine was essential for the church to celebrate the Eucharist, the monks planted vines, and that is how viticulture began in the region of Patrimonio. The Pisans had started making wines called les vignes navigate, which referred to the wines of Patrimonio and Cape Corsica, which were loaded on boats in the nearby port of St. Florent. Then they were taken to the other side of Cape Corsica, to Elba Longa, where they were tasted and had to pass a sort of navigation test. The wines that travelled well were selected for further shipment to the finest homes in Pisa. There was a certain pope, I don't remember his name, as well as several other popes who would drink only Patrimonio wines. Later, around the turn of the 19th century, the improved road network allowed the development of more vineyards in the Patrimonio region. At that time, the wine could be brought the short distance to Bastia by cart. It was consumed there, but much of it was also loaded on ships travelling to big French cities like Marseille. Thus it journeyed even to Paris. The wine was also shipped to the former French colonies, such as Indochina. For example, the Patrimonio wines were served at the Saigon Palace Hotel because the establishment was run by a Corsican, and this was true of many other restaurants or bars managed by Corsicans. These were the reasons that the wine achieved such wide renown far beyond the island.
The church where we are now is under the patronage of Saint Martin. Saint Martin of Tours, who is a great saint, is also the patron of vintners here, so he's a very strong symbol in these agricultural regions. Saint Martin was often celebrated and invoked. He's the saint of prosperity. He's the Historically, the coastal areas had always been dangerous places to live because of invasions and especially because of pirate raids. To ensure protection, the villages were situated inland. Livestock was herded from grazing pastures on the coast to those in the mountains, resulting in an exchange of traditions. The traditional laudesi singing is a very ancient Corsican tradition. It dates back to the Franciscan period. Saint Francis of Assisi spoke of Corsica, saying it was his navicella. It seemed like a boat to him because Corsica seems to float on the water. The song we just sang is very representative of the Baroque period and was composed right here along Cape Corsica, by the sea. We performed it in the polyphonic tradition. The interaction between the coastal area and the interior of the island is obvious. People could go back and forth very easily, and these exchanges existed since ancient times, since the Roman or Etruscan periods.
Croisé.